There we go. So today we'll finish up chapter 10 and get into, we'll finish up chapter 10. And in finishing chapter 10, we'll look at, we introduced game theory on Monday, but today we'll finish up this talk on game theory and move forward with some examples with that and really explain what's going on with it. And then towards the end of today, we have a couple examples that we have come up, a couple real world examples, a couple little games that we may see. And then at the very end, we have a little bit on why can it sometimes be hard to actually enforce this cooperation, right? So we said, and we'll kind of see where that comes in a second. So we ended last time introducing game theory. And again, the basic idea of this is that we have to make decisions what to do, and we're analyzing decisions that depend on what the other player does. So if we think about something like rock, paper, scissors, which we will analyze, if I knew what you were going to do, my decision is different depending on what you're going to do. However, if we played a game that involved a situation where I had a choice to breathe or not, pretty much regardless of what you do, I'm going to be better off to breathe because you kind of have to breathe to live. So we'll kind of look into that and see what we have going on. So underneath game theory, a couple things that I kind of throw in to our deal. The first thing that I look into is what's called a dominant strategy. So when we're talking about game theory, we're going to have a choice of 2 or 3 moves to make that we can make. And what a dominant strategy is going to be a decision that we make, a decision that a player makes, regardless of what the other player does. And what I'm going to be doing is just introducing a few definitions and come back through and put the application in. So regardless of what the other does. So we have a dominant strategy. And the second type of thing we're going to see is called a Nash equilibrium. And what this is going to be a set of choices where both players will opt for the status quo. And we're looking at 2-player games just because it's a little more straightforward. And if we were to try to get a third player in, things get messy. So we're sticking with 2 players for now, where both players will opt for the status quo. And another way to think of Nash equilibrium, kind of an alternative definition, is that it's a set of moves where no player can make themselves, or where no player can by themselves become better off. So what we're looking at is, and we'll kind of see graphically, we'll see how all this looks in a couple minutes. So the scenario that we run into with this, or the situation, the common scenario game that we're going to play is a game that gives us what's called this prisoner's dilemma. And what we're going to see is that in the definition, the gains from cooperation are larger than the rewards from pursuing self-interest. So basically what this is saying is ideally we could both cooperate. In the example here, ideally we're both going to want to remain silent, but it's going to be hard for us to do it because if we pursue our self-interest, as individuals we'll become better off regardless of what the other player does. So to analyze this, suppose that we have prisoner A and prisoner B. If you wanted, if it helps, you can say we have Bonnie and Clyde, or whatever your favorite pair of uh, criminals are. And I'm going to start out supposing that I'm Bonnie, right? So I'm prisoner A first. Uh, so in this case, I can kind of do two things. When I'm making my decision of what move am I going to make, I need to look at what am I going to do if the other person is cooperates or remains silent, or what do I do if the other person confesses or does not cooperate with me. So what I can do is I can look at is first, um, I can come in and I don't recommend crossing this out. I'm crossing it out because I can easily erase that. But the first thing I'm going to do as Bonnie is I'm going to say, well, if I know that Clyde is going to remain silent or cooperate, I have a choice between either 2 years in prison or 1 year in prison. In which case, if I had this situation, I would rather have 1 year than 2 years. So if I know that Clyde is going to remain silent, I'm going to go ahead and confess, just because I know that I'll become better off. And similarly, I'm going to look at it if I knew that Clyde was going to confess, right? I know for a fact that he'll do that. So in this case, I have a choice of either 8 years in prison or 5 years in prison, in which case, again, I'd rather have 5 years. So I'm again going to choose to confess. So in this example, and I'm going to come back and we'll look at Clyde in a second. But in this example, if we look and see what our dominant strategy is, and our dominant strategy will be for each player. So we have one for Bonnie and one for Clyde. So in this case, I'm playing as Bonnie first. So no matter what Clyde does, I chose to confess, right? Because I'm better off confessing if Clyde is silent. I'm better off confessing if Clyde confesses. So in this case, my dominant strategy is going to be to confess. And similarly, if we look at it from Clyde's perspective, we can start out with I can start out say, well, what happens if I know that Bonnie is going to remain silent? Which case I'll not worry about the confess state, but just worry about this one. So I have a choice between either 2 years in prison or 1 year, in which case, again, I'd rather go to prison for 1 year than 2 years. And similarly, on the other side, oops, let's erase that too. So similarly, on the other side, if I know that Bonnie is going to confess, cross that out. I have a choice between either 8 years or 5 years, in which case, again, I would rather spend only 5 years in prison. So just like Bonnie, Clyde, no matter what Bonnie does, Clyde is going to choose to confess. So Clyde decides to confess. So on the other side, we have our Nash equilibrium. And with this, what we're going to do is we kind of want to, and as we work through more and more, we'll be able to kind of eyeball it and see what's going on. But we just want to analyze each set of decisions and figure out what we should do. So on the first thing we can do is analyze this first one. Right, so what if we both remain silent? And if we look back at our definition really quick, I'm looking for a set of moves where no player can become better off by themselves. So if we're in a position and either player can improve their situation, we don't have Nash equilibrium. So if we start out in this case, we're both remaining silent. I see that Bonnie can become better off by confessing. So this point up here, or this box, would not be a Nash equilibrium. Similarly, if I'm down here at the point that we just moved to, where Bonnie decides to confess now, but in this spot, Clyde can now become better off by switching his move. So this point, again, is not going to be a Nash equilibrium. Up here, if we look at this top, and I am kind of doing this a little Dora style, but oh well. At this point up here, where Clyde's confessing and Bonnie's remaining silent, Bonnie can become better off by switching to a confess. So this point again wouldn't be a Nash equilibrium. But if we're in this bottom right-hand corner, what we're going to see happen is if Bonnie decides to switch, she'll go from 5 years to 8 years, which makes her worse off. However, if Clyde decides to switch, he'll go from 5 years over to 8 years. So that would make him worse off. So when we're in this bottom right hand corner where we're both confessing, neither of us can become better off. So our Nash equilibrium would be for both parties or both players to confess. And this is unfortunate because ideally we could be up here in this case where we both remain silent. So this would be, if we think about so we have our Nash equilibrium down here. If we think about what's our socially optimal outcome, and again, in this case, our socially optimal is what's best for our two players, not necessarily society. Maybe society wants Bonnie and Clyde locked up for life, but in this situation, we're looking at who's in the game, and that's what we're looking for. So our Nash equilibrium is both players confess, but ideally, the socially optimal would be for both players to remain silent. And this is kind of the framework of prisoner's dilemma. We want to be silent. We both want to be quiet and only do 2 years, but since we both act in our self-interest, we end up in our Nash equilibrium. And not every game will work out this way. Well, any game that deals with prisoner's dilemma will work out this way, but there may be some games where, excuse me, there may be some games where we have this situation. There'll be some games where we have maybe multiple Nash equilibriums. There'll be some games where there are no Nash equilibrium. And throughout this morning, we'll kind of look at a few and really look in at every situation that comes up, or close to every situation. So as we get into applications of this, the first one that we're going to look at is affirm. So we can look at here, and we're introducing the idea of a duopoly. So we have an oligopoly with only two firms. This is what we have, a duopoly. So for this example, what we're going to do is we're going to consider that we have two gas stations, Casey's and Come and Go. There we go. So we have Casey's and Come and Go. And what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that these are the only two gas stations in a town, or they're the last two gas stations for 300 miles, whatever the case is. They're the only two gas stations in a certain area. And what they have a choice to do is they have a choice to either charge a high or a low price. So if this holding down output, this is going to be collusion. The same thing for Come and Go. If they decide to hold down their output, they're keeping their prices high. That's colluding. Or if they increase their output, this is going to mean a low price. So that means that they don't cooperate in their collusion agreement. So again, just kind of making a little notation for you. They have a choice to charge a high price or a low price. And same thing with Come and Go, either a high price or a low price. And again, when we're talking about what's socially optimal, the only two people in our society right now are the firms. We're not worried about how the consumers are. We're only at this point worried about the firms and how well they are. So in this case, again, if I am, we'll give Casey's red and Come and Go blue. So if I start out as Casey's, right? Just like with the prisoner's dilemma, or just like with our prisoners in the previous example, I'm going to sit and analyze, say, well, what happens if Come and Go, and see what am I going to do if I know what Come and Go is going to do. So if at first I believe that Come and Go is going to charge a high price and cooperate, right? I have to figure out what I want to do. So in this case, I have a choice of either getting $1,000 or $1,500. In which case, if I know Come and Go is going to charge a high price, I personally would rather have 1,500 than $1,000. So I'm going to go ahead and pick $1,500. And similarly, if I know that Come and Go is going to charge a low price, uh, in this case, I only look at what if they charge a low price, in which case I have a choice between $200 and $400, in which case I would rather have 400 than $200. Then Come and Go will look and they'll do the same thing if they know that Casey's is going to charge a high price and cooperate with the collusion. They have a choice between 1,000 or 1,500, in which case they'll take 1,500. And in this last one, they have a choice of 200 or 400, in which case they'll pick 400. So we have our payouts. And again, if we look at, I'm going to kind of bring this over to the side. If I look for who has the dominant, who has, or what are dominant strategies, if anybody has one, we're looking again at Casey's and Come and Go. So Casey's, regardless of what Come and Go did, Casey's opted to compete and charge a low price. So Casey's was going to put out I guess to keep with our notation, I'm going to say they increase their output, which also means they charge a low price. And Come and Go, we kind of see that they have the same, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to have, if they act in their own self-interest, they're going to increase output or charge a low price. And when we're looking at dominant strategy, and I mention this because I see this come up a few times, when we're looking at dominant strategy, if I'm looking at it from Come and Go's perspective, I actually don't care what, oops, there we go. I actually don't care what Casey's going to do. So Come and Go could, for everything that matters, they could just cross out all of what Casey's is doing, and they're only going to look at what payout will they get depending on their situation. And same thing for Casey's. They don't care what Come and Go's output is. They're looking out only for themselves. So that's where dominant strategy comes in. So on the other side of this, we have our Nash equilibrium. And in this case, our Nash equilibrium, we'll see happen if, again, we analyze each point. So if I'm up here in this top left-hand box, I see that Casey's can become better off by switching, so that's not a Nash. If I'm in this bottom left-hand corner, Come and Go can go from 200 to 400 by switching, so it's not going to work. Same thing with top right-hand, Casey's can become better off. But in this bottom right-hand box, just like before, if Casey's decides to switch, they lose $200. And if Come and Go decides to switch, they also lose $200. So our Nash equilibrium in this case, just like our standard prisoner's dilemma, will be when both firms compete and charge a low price. And again, we also see that this is contrary to what we would, as from the firm's perspective, we would like to see, because from the firms, I would rather make $1,000 than $400, but I can't cooperate. I can't cooperate because I'm going to act in my self-interest, and I believe that my opponent will act in their self-interest. So even if I'm willing to collude, I have to trust that the other party or the other firm is going to do that as well, which could run into some issues for us. That is, makes it hard for us to actually do this. So that's our oligopoly, and that's kind of the theory, the theoretical examples. From here, what I have is a couple examples. So a couple like real world applications. Maybe take a couple, throw a couple curveballs at you with them. So the two applications that actually first I'm gonna go through the different a couple different games, a couple different ways that this can all work out. Then I'll get into the applications and we'll see some issues that can come up. So a couple other games. And these are more, again, not like super real. Well, one of them's rock, paper, scissors, but a couple more games before we get into our applications. So the first thing I want to look at is a game of rock, paper, scissors. And with rock, paper, scissors, what we see is we're going to have two players, right? Player one and player two. And each player has a choice to pick either rock, paper, or scissor. I'm going to give a little bit more space because it works out nice. So we have rock, paper, and scissor. And boom. And player two also has the same choices to make. They can pick either rock, paper, or scissor. Something like that. And we should be good to go. And in each payout, or in each set of choices, we're going to see that they each are going to get a payout. And so to do that, I'm just going to take a second really quick and lay my framework really quick. So we have player one, player two, all the way across. So the game that we're going to play is we're going to play for $1. And what we're going to say is that if you win, then you get $1. A draw means you get nothing. And if you lose, you will lose $1. Right? Or you gain minus $1, however you want to phrase that. So the first thing we can do is we know that if we end up tying, that is, we both pick the same thing, we have a payout of nothing. Right? It's like a push. We each get our money back, or however you want to phrase it. But if we tie, we don't get anything. However, for the other situations, I can kind of look into and say, well, as I go through, can figure out, well, what are we going to win? What would we lose? And so on. So if it's rock versus paper, if player one picks rock, player two picks paper. In this case, player one would lose, player two would win because paper covers rock. And on this third one, rock smashes scissor. So player one would gain $1 and player two would lose $1. Let me get this written right. There we go. And same thing down here. If player one is paper and player two is rock, then player one will win $1 and player two will lose $1. If player one is paper versus scissor, player one loses. And in scissor versus rock, player one would lose, player two would win. And scissors versus paper, player one wins, player two loses. So we have our situation drawn. And what I'm going to do again is I'm going to want to look and see if there is a dominant strategy. And like before, I'll look for both player one and player two. And then I will look for a Nash equilibrium. So in this game, we all have choices to make and so on. So I'll start out as player one, and I'll give player one red and player two blue. So if I'm player one, I have to make choices depending on what they're going to do. So if I know that player two is going to pick rock, and I'm not going to do this for every single this whole thing for every single outcome, but if I know that player two is going to pick rock, the only thing I care about is what they're going to pick rock. What they do I'm only going to consider what they do if they pick rock. So I have a choice between $0 $1 or losing $1, in which case I'm going to go ahead and take my winning of $1 because I'd rather win than lose. Similarly, if I know that player 2 is going to pick paper, I have a choice of -1, 0, or 1, in which case I'll pick my win. And if I know that player 2 will pick the scissors, I'm going to go ahead and pick rock. And similarly, if I'm player 2, I'll look at it kind of the same way. So first case, I want to see what happens if player 1 picks rock, in which case I have a choice of 0, 1, or -1. So I'll pick 1, pick paper. If I know player 2, excuse me, if I'm player 2 and I know player 1 picks paper, I'm going to go ahead and pick scissor. And if I know player 1 picks scissor, I'm going ahead and pick rock. So first bit we're interested in is there a dominant strategy? So if I look for player 1, well, I see not really, because if player 2 picks rock, player 1 pick paper, player 2 picks paper, player 1 picks scissors. So player 1 will change their strategy depending on what the other player does. So in this case, we have none. And if we look at player 2, we'll see a similar situation. If player 1 picks rock, player 2 picks paper. And if player 1 picks paper, player 2 picks scissor. So player 2's move is going to depend on what player 1 does. So player 2 also has no dominant strategy. Then if we look for Nash equilibrium, we can do it. I'm not going to go through every single point, but I'll go through a couple and we'll see a pattern emerge. So what if we are currently in a situation where both players pick rock, right? So they both win, they both tie, and they get nothing. Well, player 1 can switch over to paper and get $1. So this point would not be Nash equilibrium because player 1 can make themselves better off. But what if we come into this new spot? Well, now player 2 has -$1, and player 2 can switch to either paper or scissor and become better off. So again, this point would not be a Nash equilibrium. Then if we came over here, player 1 can become better off by switching, and if we came over here, player 1 can be better off by switching, and so on and so on. And if we went through every single point, we would see that there is no Nash equilibrium for this situation. So in this case, we have a case, no dominant strategies, no Nash equilibriums. Then another situation we can have is suppose that we have a game where we have to go to I'm going to call it a movie game. And the rules of this are you lose your phone. You lose your phone, and you need to see a show with a friend. Right, and you have no way to get in contact with them. So the only way to find out where they are is to buy a ticket to a movie. And same thing for them, right? They can't find out where they are is to buy a ticket. And if you buy a ticket, you can't like go see I can't buy a ticket to a horror movie and go see a comedy or so on. So we have this situation, you lose your phone, you have no way to get in contact with your friend, but you have to figure out what to do and which movie to go to. So I'm going to suppose that we have our two players, and I'll pick Bonnie and Clyde again. Why not? If I make my own names, I'm going to end up coming up with two names to start with a J because I don't know why I just do. So I'm going to stick with Bonnie and Clyde again. We're going to say that Bonnie likes comedies and Clyde likes a horror film. So we're going to have a situation where we have to figure out what to go see. So we have Clyde and Bonnie, and they have a choice to go see, again, a horror or a comedy. And Bonnie also has a choice: go see a horror or a comedy. And the only way they can figure out if they picked the right movie is to actually go. So we can do something like this. Then for each payout again, we'll have a Bonnie and a Clyde. And in this case, my unit, or I'm measuring utility, and it's going to be relatively arbitrary, but higher is better. Right, so when we were talking about years in prison, we wanted a lower. I want fewer years in prison. When I'm talking about money, I want more money. In this case, the higher the utility, the better. So, and our ultimate goal is to wind up together. I would rather see a movie I don't care for uh, with my friend not than see a movie by myself. So we can kind of analyze our payoffs, and we see that if we both end up in the horror movie, Bonnie likes comedy, Clyde likes horror. So I'm going to say that this gives Clyde 10 and Bonnie 9 utility. And same thing down here with the comedy. If they both pick the comedy, I'm just going to flip it. Uh, right, they went to the movie that the other person likes better, but they're still happy because they're with their friend. So now what happens if they end up in the wrong show? So if they pick wrong, so we said that Bonnie likes comedy. So if Bonnie picks comedy, I'm going to give her a utility 2, while Clyde a utility. Oops. I'm going to give her a utility 2 if she picks comedy, but it's the wrong one. And if Bonnie picks the horror and it's the wrong one, I'm going to give her a utility of 0. Whereas for Clyde, if Clyde picks the comedy, which he doesn't necessarily care for, he gets a 0 and a 2. So as we analyze this, we're going to be able to kind of see what we can end up with. So just like before, we're looking for dominant strategies and a Nash equilibrium. And with this, what we also see is that just because we're playing a game with somebody doesn't necessarily mean that we're playing against them, right? So in this case, we want to end up in the same place because if Clyde is better off, so is Bonnie, and same thing, vice versa. So with our dominant strategy, we have Clyde and Bonnie. And let's just see what happens. So if Clyde knows that Bonnie's going to pick the horror movie, he has a choice between either 10 utility or 0 utility, in which case, just like before, he'll pick 10. And similarly, if Clyde knows that Bonnie will pick the comedy, he has a choice of 2 or 9, in which case he'll take the 9 utility. And same thing for Bonnie. If she knows that Clyde will pick a horror film, she'll pick the horror as well. If Bonnie knows that Clyde will pick the comedy, she will pick the comedy. So if we look for a dominant strategy, again, we'll see there is no dominant strategies because they switch their move depending on what the other person does. However, if we look for a Nash equilibrium, let's say we start out in this spot with a comedy and a horror. So in this case, if either player switches, they become better off. So if Clyde decides to switch from the comedy to the horror, he will then become happier. And same thing with Bonnie, if she switches from the comedy, if she switches from the horror to the comedy, she will become better off. So this point down here is not. And same thing with this point up here. Obviously, hopefully it follows the same pattern. The upper right-hand corner will not be a Nash equilibrium as well. But what if we're in this spot where we both go to the comedy? In this case, if Bonnie switches, she becomes worse off. So she'll become worse off. Or if Clyde switches, he'll become worse off as well. So in this case, they can't become better off by themselves. So this one, I'll just keep highlighted in gold because it is a Nash equilibrium. But then if we also look at this one, where they're both in the horror film, if Bonnie switches, she'll become worse off. If Clyde switches, he becomes worse off. So just like the one down here, both of these will be Nash equilibrium. So our Nash equilibrium we can phrase in a couple ways. One, it's either when both players see the same movie, or we can also abbreviate this as horror and comedy. Kind of two different ways to phrase this. But in this case, we actually have two Nash equilibrium. So the point is, as we go through different situations, you can kind of analyze and see how things work out. But you do want to kind of look through, do that full analysis. That way you can kind of figure out how everything's going to work out. And, just so you can make your decisions and have them be right, I guess. So the most common game we'll see is going to be the dominant strategy, which we saw up here. But there are these other games that we can do, and if you ever come across a game like this, you can do a similar analysis. Chess would be a little harder because there's a lot going on, but if you have any game where there's a relatively fixed amount of moves, you can figure out where you should end up or what move you should make, whatever the case is. So the next little bit I have is some, next thing I have is some applications. And depending on time, I have two, but I'll get through one for sure. So two applications I'm interested in are political campaigns and the Cold War, the arms race from the Cold War. So nuclear weapons. So the first one, we have political campaigns. So what we'll do is we'll see how the situation works, and then go back through and look at some implications of this. See, what came out because of this prisoner's dilemma case. So we are looking at application of prisoner's dilemma. So first thing we have is political campaigns, and I'm going to have two parties, and I'm going to stick with the two parties in the country. So we have Republicans and Democrats, which the label is R and D. And our choices are going to be to either smear or run a clean campaign. So ideally, right, and at the beginning of every election season, you have these politicians, they come through and they say, oh, I'm going to run a clean campaign. I'm going to focus on the issues. I'm going to be this, this great candidate who just focuses on the issues. But what we end up seeing is everybody decides that I need to attack the other person and I need to talk bad about the other person. So we have these choices and political campaigns, and we just want to see what happens. So we have our two parties, Republicans and Democrats. And I'm sticking with Republicans and Democrats because they're the two most popular, and so on. So if you're a Libertarian, Green, whatever other party, Constitution, not trying to be uninclusive, it's just to keep things simple. So they again have this choice to run a clean campaign or a smear campaign. And same thing with the Democrats, they can run a clean or a smear. I'm going to go ahead and actually just write that out, that way we can see it. And I'm going to give the common colors that we have. I'll put Republicans in red, Democrats in blue, and we'll set up our table. That should be good. And that should be good. So our payouts will be to Republican and Democrat all the way down. And we'll just see, again, what happens. Give that a little more space. Boom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suppose that if we both run a clean campaign, And Democrats being red won't do me much good, so I should probably give them a nice blue. But if we both run a clean campaign, we're going to say that we both get about 10,000 votes. You can put +1 to your favorite party. I'm not going to do that on here because that just opens up a can of worms I don't want to deal with. So we each have these 10,000 votes, and that's 10,000, not 10,060. We each get 10,000 votes. The basic idea of this is that the election is going to come down to the election night, right? It's going to be a close election. Maybe we're up till midnight, waiting for those last results to come in. It's going to be exciting. There's not going to be polls close at 7 and there's a result published at 7:01, right? It's going to be a good election. But suppose that I'm the Republican first, and I'm going to do the same thing for the Democrat in a couple minutes, in a couple seconds. But if first I'm a Republican, and I say, you know what? I got some dirt on my Democratic opponent. So in this case, and I come in, I get that dirt, and I release it. So suppose that changed their vote to 12,000 versus 5,000. The key point of this is if I as a Republican decide to run a smear campaign, and it's not countered, I'm going to easily win the election on election night. However, on the same story, if I'm the Democrat and I do the same thing and I decide, you know what, I'm going to run a smear, we'll see the exact same, kind of the same thing happen where that happens. Then if we both decide to run a smear campaign, I'm going to say we both get 7,000 votes. So again, the key point, the numbers themselves, I'm not super worried about, but the key point is if we both run a clean campaign, so if we're both up here, it's going to be a good race. If we both decide to smear, it's going to be a close campaign as well. However, if only one party decides to run attack ads, that party will for sure win because everybody knows how terrible the candidate that got attacked is. So in this case, we'll again, not start with Nash. We'll start out looking at our dominant strategy. And I'll start out as a Republican. So if I'm a Republican, I know that the Democrats going to run a clean campaign. I have a choice to either have a close election or I know I can have the clean win. In which case, I would rather have the for sure win. And same thing if I'm the Democrat, if I know that I have a choice between a close election and an easy win, I would rather take an easy win. Right. And if it's a case where a job's on the line, I'd rather right in like a basketball game or a baseball game, you maybe you want to play a team that's maybe it's more fun to play a team that's evenly matched with you and you have that exciting finish. But if I'm the politician or if I'm going for a job, I want to be the best applicant by far. So similarly, so then I wonder what happens if I'm a Republican. What do I do if the Democrats are going to smear me? Now I have a choice to either lose or have a close election, in which case I'll choose the close election. And similarly, if I'm the Democrat, I have a choice to either lose or have a close election, in which case I'm going to take the close election. So you see our dominant strategy for the Republicans and Democrats. For Republicans, he's going to smear and smear. So no matter what, they want to run a smear campaign or run attack ads is how this problem is published. And if I'm the Democrat, similarly, no matter what, I want to go ahead and run that smear campaign. So I'm going to talk bad about the other candidate as an individual. So our dominant strategy, no matter what, is to smear. And we'll see that our Nash equilibrium, and I'm just going to get to it rather than going through every situation. But our Nash equilibrium, by same application as before, is for both parties to smear, for both candidates to attack the other. And that's near Nash equilibrium, which would be this case down here. I'm just going to focus on the applications of this, then we'll be done for today. But what are the what are the effects of this? And so there are some situations where this will work out to benefit, where the collusion would work out to benefit us. Other cases where we want our firms to compete. But in this case, we're going to actually see that this is mostly negative. That is, on one note, there's no change in the results. We started out with a close campaign and we ended with a close campaign. And if you did like a +1-to-1 candidate, whoever got your +1 is going to be the winner, regardless of whether we run a clean campaign or a smear campaign. So there is no change in the results, but we have a lower voter turnout. In this case, we had 14,000 instead of 20,000. So what happened was, in essence, right, you have people who are, and with any election, you have kind of a few groups of people. You have hardcore Republicans and hardcore Democrats, right? And those are two different groups, but you have people who, no matter what, they would vote Republican, or no matter what, they would vote Democrat. Then you have your people in the middle. Of your people in the middle, they may be more inclined to vote one way or the other, but if one candidate is terrible, they'll vote for the other, or vice versa. And if they're both terrible, maybe they just decide not to vote at all. So we have this lower turnout, and we see, right, we have 6,000 less people voting. So which, we'd like to have everybody participating. But the other couple things are, I think, kind of interesting. The third thing that I kind of phrase is we are either under or over scrutinous. Let's spell this right. Scrutinous of a candidate, of our public officials. So what I mean by that is my candidate can do no wrong. Whoops, helps if you spell it right. Can do no wrong. And this is our under case where I don't give any scrutiny to my candidate. But on the other side, the other person, the other candidate, can do no good. And this is where we are over scrutinous. And you've probably, if you pay attention, you'll see this with any candidate, whether it's Republican or Democrat. If we look at President Trump, there are people who are going to say no matter what, he can do no good. There are people out there who say no matter what, he can do no wrong. And same thing happened with Obama. I saw people who, no matter what, there was nothing good he could do. No matter what, there was nothing wrong he can do. Which, in reality, if we really went through and analyzed our policies, odds are there'd be some things we're for and some things we're against for every candidate. But we can be over or under scrutinous of public officials. And the fourth kind of thing that comes out of this is a polarization of the country. And a part of what this comes from is, if we think about this, so everybody's running smear ads, smear campaigns, or everyone's running attack ads. One of the things that you probably remember, and one of the things that you get to, so kind of along with this over under scrutinous, you may not remember what policies the other candidate had, right? So and this probably goes either way. If in say 2012 you voted for Obama, there's probably a decent chance you do not remember what Romney's actual positions were. Instead, you probably more remember Um, I think the gap that he had was the binders of women was his thing, right? He said, "I'm gonna hire women. I have binders full of them," right? So that's probably the thing you remember from that campaign. However, if on the 2016 campaign, if you voted for Trump, so I'm switching sides. If you voted for Trump in 2016, potentially you don't remember like what Hillary Clinton's actual policies were. You probably remember the taglines, the things. You probably remember the emails and stuff like that. So you have this polarization, and what we end up doing is we say when we look at someone who voted for somebody else, and this is my last little point, and I'll be done. When we're looking at someone who voted for someone else, we don't see them as voting for a set of policies, but instead voting for the the skeletons in that person's closet. So if uh, if I voted for Romney, I'm voting for those binders of women. That one gap is what I'm voting for. Similarly, if I voted for Hillary, I'd be voting for uh, the deleted emails or whatever the big thing for her was. So, and the reason I don't pick on the current is because the person who gets elected, you probably actually know what their policy stances are. So that's why I'm picking on the losers in the elections. But the polarization, it just makes it hard to talk about anything uh, and brings that up in the country. So that's chapter 10. It's hard to enforce cooperation because we have to act against our self-interest, which we don't like to do. But that's chapter 10, and I'm going to get the recording off for you.